Hello, everybody. Today is Saturday, January the 13th. Um, Today, I'm going to be looking at primarily Jupiter and Uranus and Taurus. Jupiter has stationed direct a little bit before New Year's. It was stationing direct around New Year's. And now it's in direct motion. It's moving through Taurus, and we're going to be having a conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus coming up soon. And that is primarily what's on my mind. However, it's also worth noting that Jupiter is in a sextile right now with Saturn. That's perfect by 1 degree. And I was also considering maybe doing this video about Saturn and Neptune and Jupiter and Uranus, but then it starts to feel like a bit much. But there is, Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces, and there are in the sextile aspect, so it's not completely unrelated. The thing, I've been developing an idea which feels a bit kind of messy in my mind right now, but I'm going to attempt to just kind of dive into it here. And the entry point that I want to start with is perhaps, and this is why I was talking about the Saturn and Neptune thing, is I wanted to start with this book from Liz Greene, The Astrological Neptune and the Quest for Redemption, right? And, I mean, if I was making this all about Uranus, it may seem a bit odd that somebody is, to start with Neptune. But there's this one part that I kind of wanted to read here, to introduce something. No planet owns exclusive rights to spirituality, and every planet has its own approach to the divine. The planetary gods of ancient astrology were understood to be personifications of attributes of the One, and any of these planets dominant in an individual horoscope might provide a valid, if incomplete, worldview and an appropriate route to what Plato called the eternal realities. James Hillman defines archetypes as modes of perception, which is an excellent way of understanding the manner in which a planet works when it is strong in the birth chart. One perceives and evaluates the world through the lens of the archetypal pattern which is closest to one's own mind, body, heart, and soul. The mercurial individual can be as deeply spiritual as anyone else, but the bright light of the numinous may reveal itself in the miracle of human thought, speech, ingenuity, and craftsmanship. The Saturnian person, too, may be deeply spiritual, but may eschew the sentimentality which personalizes God, instead recognizing the presence of deity in the immutable laws which underpin the material universe. Hence, Gauquelin, in his statistical work, found that Saturn culminating was a characteristic of the horoscopes of scientists, some of whom evidence of their own form of worship in the pursuit of scientific truth. The Plutonian may discover the divine in the abyss through the compulsive workings of passion and fateful encounters, or through the wisdom of those instincts which support us when we can no longer support ourselves. The martial personality may touch the divine in those inspired acts of courage and valor which are as unexpected as they are noble. The Jupiterian may pursue the clues of a meaningful cosmos through the dawning recognition that every life experiences teaches a lesson in the growth of the soul. Uranus, like Descartes, may discover deity in the human power of reason and the unquenchable human spirit of progress. Chiron may glimpse the face of God in the power of human compassion to heal that which life has wounded. And Venus may experience a higher or deeper reality in the wonders of musical or mathematical harmony and symmetry, or in the manifest beauty of nature and the human form. Because there are many archetypal modes of perception, there are and always have been many religions existing in the world. For each religion also partakes of a particular archetypal perspective which resonates with its adherents, but may invoke indifference or even animosity in those for whom its vision of deity is deeply inappropriate. Neptune is no more spiritual than Mercury or Saturn or Mars, for it is not the one, merely one of the planets, and thus reflecting one particular archetypal perception of the divine. This perception is unquestionably mystical in that it depends upon an inner emotional state of fusion and experiences deity as an unconditionally loving maternal source. Even if rational consciousness ascribes a masculine name and a masculine face. The Neptunian is no follower of orthodoxy, although he or she may pursue or become the charismatic guru who enchants his or her followers with the promise of eternal bliss in this world or beyond it. Yet even when Neptune enters the church, mosque, synagogue, or temple dressed in collectively acceptable clothes, the motivating power lies not with the intellectual appeal or moral force of traditional doctrine, but in the ecstatic experience of being taken out of oneself. And then this carries on and she starts talking about St. John of the Cross and a reading from St. John of the Cross. Now, so what my idea for this video was primarily looking at Jupiter, which is direct in Taurus, which is approaching Uranus. It is also in a sextile with Saturn in Pisces, and Saturn in Pisces is also in direct motion now and is approaching a conjunction with Neptune, right? So both of these things kind of go together. The main thing that stood out for me when reading this that I would like to highlight is the thing about the difference between Neptune and Uranus, and Liz Greene here making the specific reference to Rene Descartes with Uranus. Okay? Now, the thing about Rene Descartes is that, I mean, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of the philosophy here, Rene Descartes himself was actually a Christian and was not, he never had any goal of creating a kind of like atheistic, non-Christian, non-religious perspective. But he did something which kind of coined this idea about Cartesian dualism, I think, therefore I am, and it's kind of become associated with this idea of mind over matter, right? And in contrast to that perspective, this archetypal perspective that is Uranian, the Neptune perspective indicates a trend that I have noticed that tends to proliferate in spiritual circles where people it's a kind of a reaction almost against this kind of Cartesianism, which was this kind of separation of thought from the immersion in the physical world, and instead is looking for what Liz Greene was talking about, fusion, or a kind of maternalistic, unconditional love. And this is the thing, you commonly hear this sort of thing in spiritual circles about the problem with modern society is that the people are living in their heads but not their hearts, or that the head has become separated from the heart, or that the head has become separated from the body, and that we're all divided up in misalignment and all this kind of stuff. And that there's, like, I often, that there's, the downside to this is that it can sometimes be this sort of air of anti-intellectualism, or you try to approach somebody with an idea or a question or something like that, they're like, well, just don't think about it. Or, you're lost in your mind. You need to quiet the mind and envelop yourself in a state of silence. And then, then it will be revealed to you, kind of thing. Like so what Liz Greene is doing in this book is she's kind of pointing out that she's not saying one is necessarily right or wrong, but that these are archetypal perspectives that are themselves not indicative of the whole. That Neptune kind of makes this claim towards oneness, but really itself is a fragmented perspective. And Uranus is also a fragmented perspective, right? And the thing about this, why that I thought to start here in this thing about contrasting Uranus and Neptune with what Liz Greene has to say about it, is that if we factor in Jupiter making this conjunction with Uranus in Taurus, that Taurus is in an earth sign, and Taurus is often associated with the body, the voice, the few things like food, their relation to the physical, sensual world around us. And another thing is that I mentioned in my previous videos, I also have I've had a significant boost of new subscribers recently. Thank you for everybody who is new and tuning in and who's just recently subscribed to my channel. Thank you for the support. I had mentioned that, part of my history, or where I'm coming from, that I went through, whether you want to call it a psychosis or a spiritual emergency or whatever, this was way back in 2011, 2012 when it happened for me, and I got mixed up in the mental health system for a while. I had a couple of comments from people saying that they've had similar things happen and they were interested to hear me talk about this. But I am doing astrology videos, and my focus here is to only bring this up in the sense that it's valid for the astrology, in the sense that it's valid or it's relevant for what I'm doing here. But one of the things that I noticed in becoming involved in this sort of, like trying to look for the spiritual perspective, or getting involved in this sort of different way of approaching these things, is that it almost became like a bit of a cliche, in that whenever you were having problems, people would always say that what you need is to do is ground, right? That if you are, let's say, like, and the other thing too is that I would also just say that I think that to me, that I've talked about this stuff so much that it starts to become redundant, but it's important to recognize that there are risks in terms of becoming delusional, right? Like, if you have these experiences, you may have a valid experience, and then your mind runs off with you in either some kind of fantasy that's not connected to reality, or that based on something you experienced, you start trying to interpret it in such a way, and your interpretation doesn't match up with what is actually going on. Or that, there's the classic thing with mania is like, delusions of grandeur, or, and so basically the usual, remedy that is recommended for all sorts of these kinds of things, like is looking at it in terms of grounding versus being ungrounded, right? And I have to admit that for a long time, I was kind of frustrated with this approach to looking at things, and also the tendency around this whole construct, or this whole way of approaching the situation, that grounding, for example, means a number of different things. For one thing, there is the idea that our bodies have electromagnetic fields, and that if you're, like, one of the things that I'm not completely against the idea of grounding. There is in terms of actual physical laws, in terms of electromagnetic activity and stuff like this, is that when you are, this whole thing about touching grass, right? Because I think, is there something about this Jupiter and Uranus and Taurus that kind of goes with this, you know, you are, we live in such a technological society where we're on the internet and all this time. It's become a common kind of phrase to, you know, take a break from all this stimulation and go out and, you know, take deep breaths and touch grass and connect to the earth. And I'm not saying, I'm not, you know, I don't see that there's anything wrong with that. I think that maybe that is a valid thing. And there's this whole thing too, as well as this basic, like, if you're wearing sneakers or shoes that have rubber on them, rubber acts as an electrical isolating effect, right? So that when you are wearing shoes, you are not, your electromagnetic field is not connecting to the earth as well. So there's this whole thing about having bare feet and walking in the grass, or not wearing shoes at home, that connects your electromagnetic field to the environment around you. And, you know, that may very well be an important thing, but there's all this other stuff about grounding, which is like, you know, like if you become too lost in your thoughts and you're like, if you're on some sort of train of thought and then you forget about your body, you forget that you need to eat. You're like, when was the last time I had a meal? When was the last time I drank a glass of water? You know, and all these, there's a sort of basic, what falls into the category of like self-care around this. And all this stuff is helpful. You know, it's good to take care of your body. It's good to be, you know, stay connected to the material world and all this kind of stuff. But there's something about this which I feel like there's something, there's some other side to this which I feel kind of gets lost, right? And okay, I'm going to back up a little bit and approach this from this whole thing about Cartesian dualism and all this kind of stuff, right? That there was this, and that the whole idea of mind over matter. There's this, one of the things that I have to talk, you know, that I have gotten into, I guess I could keep going on this thread about spiritual emergency and all this kind of stuff. I'm just like I said, I have a kind of a complicated idea, and I'm just trying to parse out how best to approach this as I'm in the process of recording this. In recent years, have been reading a lot. I've been reading a lot of philosophy. And this is again one of the common critics. There's a lot of people who have this sort of attitude of being disillusioned with things like literature and philosophy and reading books, and instead like going towards this Neptune perspective of fusion and immersion with the environment and grounding and all this kind of stuff. Or getting away from the noise of the mind and all this kind of thing, right? But there's this if you're understanding this Jupiter-Uranus conjunction and understanding what Uranus means and where the meaning comes from, that Uranus was first discovered. It was kind of interesting that, you know, recently I made this video about Pluto in Aquarius. When I was doing research into this, one of the things that I noticed, but I didn't mention in that video, was that it was during this time after the American Declaration of Independence, when Pluto went into Aquarius. This was actually around the time when the planet Uranus was first discovered, right? And one of the ways in which these new modern outer planets have got their significations is that somehow based on some of the things that have been going on in the history during the time of when they were discovered, and because you had the French Revolution and the American Revolution happening around the time of the discovery of Uranus, Uranus was given this revolutionary, rebellious signification. the other thing that Uranus is often associated with is technology and science and technological advancement, right? Now, the thing about Jupiter and Uranus together and science and technology is like, this is the whole thing, is that it is often associated with this thing of a eureka moment, or this kind of like having these ideas which are maybe at first theoretical in nature, but then eventually translate into the advent of new forms of science and technology, but for better or worse, because we are now we've seen all the things that science and technology and industrialization have brought us, that we have a degree of being, we see the good and the bad of it, right? But there is like something about the Cartesian quality is kind of like mind over matter, right? In that we have some sort of kind of more abstract or theoretical insight into how things work, and then eventually those kinds of insights and developments lead into become technologies which have the effect of actually transforming the actual lived day-to-day life, day-to-day reality that we have, into such an extent that it's really like, the fact that I'm living in a house that has electrical light, central heating, that's piped, natural gas heating that's piped into the house, that's hooked up to a huge, and then that I can record a video that goes on the internet and all this stuff, and without even necessarily even having my scientific understanding myself of how all this stuff works, and yet our whole day-to-day life and the life we live has become transformed by these advances, which at one point in time were just theoretical, right? There's this kind of attitude that people have, which kind of like turns their nose up against things which seem too abstract or theoretical. And the thing is, like, I also don't want to it seems like a trap for me to assume that try to talk down to my audience as a kind of a lowest common denominator, right? But, what I'm trying to say is that, like, what part of what I'm interested in, regardless of astrology, and this probably has to do with, my own Sagittarius and Jupiter kind of placements or whatever, right? Is like, I am interested in ideas, and I'm interested in philosophy and all this kind of stuff. And then there's certain things which, like, I'll see people online making comments about how there's certain things that I'm interested in that people do not understand at all, or that people say, like, this just seems way too abstract. I don't understand how this abstract idea connects to the actual real life. Like, it sounds like these people are just talking gobbledygook, and what does this actually mean in terms of the actual real life that I'm living, right? And this is kind of like what I'm trying to say with, there is this idea of Cartesian dualism or mind over matter. One of the reasons why it's kind of been given a bad name or whatever is that there's this kind of sense that there's this sort of like virtual realm, or this abstract thing that just, if you get into this direction, it just becomes confusing and you lose people, and that you or whatever, right? And so, but what am I trying to say? There's this with Jupiter and Uranus and Taurus, there seems to be extra emphasis on the idea of how do the ideas or the eureka moments, the kind of the more intellectual breakthroughs, how does that actually go back into a noticeable change? Or like what Uranus is all about, this sort of like pursuit of progress, right? The idea that like purely intellectual or abstract progress is unless it actually has some bearing upon your actual life circumstances and daily environment or whatever, right? Like, what's the point? Is it just a waste of time, right? And with all this in mind, there's another book that I was reading, and look, this is I don't want to get too off track here because the title of the book and the topic of the book are maybe not relevant to what I'm trying to approach here, but the book is a philosophy book by this guy who is a Platonist, a Neoplatonist, who tends to take things into more of maybe a Christianized Neoplatonist direction. But this guy is named Stanley Clark, and his book is called Can We Believe in People? And there's this whole question, and one of the reasons why I started reading this is that I noticed in the collective sphere in general, there is a kind of this controversy around the idea of transhumanism. And in one way, I can kind of sympathize with it because I think when a lot of people talk, well, the first thing you mentioned about transhumanism, people might think about like people putting cyborg implants, right? Like we're going to have computer chips in our brains or something like that with like, you know, Elon Musk's Neuralink and all this, right? And that I have to just, you know, there's no point in, I must say that makes me uncomfortable. I don't want that. But one of the things that I know about transhumanism is that it's not just about the difference between man and machine. It's about the relationship between humans and animals. And there's this kind of question about does the human being inhabit a special category of being a human, or is a human and an animal basically are we just animals that have developed a certain capacity more than other animals, and we're basically just animals, right? And but the thing is, it relates to, there is a spiritual bearing on all this, because the Buddhists had this map where you had the realm of the human, you had the realm of the animal, you had the realm of the hungry ghosts, and you had the hell realm, right? And that the realm of the animal was not quite as bad as being dragged into the realm of the hungry ghosts or the hell realm, but it was still beneath. But the Buddhists basically said, if you are on the Buddhist path, the Noble Eightfold Path, your job is to stay in the human realm and not get dragged into what the Lusians would say, the becoming animal, right? Although, and then what's also interesting is that the Buddhists also have this idea of the realm of the jealous gods, right? And just to carry on this tangent, the realm of the jealous gods is interesting because if you look at Uranus, there's this kind of funny because, it's not. Richard Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche makes the argument that if you want to understand the Uranus archetype, it's actually better to include the myth of Prometheus. And the idea about the myth of Prometheus is that Prometheus was a bit different than the other gods in that the other gods sometimes had even an antagonistic relationship with human beings, but Prometheus is being the one who stole the fire from the gods to give to the humans, right? And there's this whole part of the Prometheus myth where the gods and the humans are having this big feast, right? And that Prometheus is going to prepare a meal for the gods and a meal for the humans. And what he did is like take the cuts of meat that weren't so good, that had like bones in them and stuff like that, but cover them in a kind of a sauce or a layer of fat to make it look better than it was, and give that to the gods. And then meanwhile take the better piece of meat and make it look like it wasn't so good and give that to the humans. And then before before anybody is the wiser, the gods are like, hey, wait a minute, that Prometheus just gave the humans the good stuff, right? And there's this kind of like the parable of Prometheus, or of that part of the story, is that from the perspective of if you're gonna, I mean, whether depends on how, to what extent you believe the gods are really real. But if we imagine that the gods are real, but they obviously don't exist in the realm of human beings, where we have to eat food and we're young and we grow old. The gods are in some kind of eternal realm, right? Or the mythical realm. There's this idea that, like, as much as Jupiter is associated with all these stories about how Jupiter goes and gets laid and all this kind of stuff, that it's really the gods are telling stories about human experience, what it means to be a human being, and that if we fully, this idea of grounding again, right? If we are fully grounded into the lived experience of human life, we are getting the juicy cut of the meat. We are that, some abstract god or angel or spirit doesn't get to experience the sun rising, the fresh air, the song of the birds, the taste and the smells, and all the sensual experience that goes with being a human being. And sometimes that stuff is denigrated as being, the temptations, the worldly sins and temptations and attachments and stuff like that. But this whole thing about Jupiter and Uranus and Taurus, I think, and Prometheus, is about, like, grounding into the actual lived experience of life or whatever, right? But at the same time, there is this thing about there's a certain intellectual side of Prometheus, and that stealing the fire of the gods is also sort of related to having some sort of higher knowledge or higher understanding. But Prometheus gets punished with it in such a way that he has to have his guts eaten by an eagle for all of eternity. And there's something about this which kind of almost prefigures the Christ archetype, right? That Jesus Christ had to go through the passion of the Christ and was crucified, and that Prometheus and the eagle is almost kind of like this crucifixion myth. But there's kind of this thing, I think there's that underlying theme of, like, what if you have this eureka, you have this insight and all this kind of stuff, but you are unable to translate that into your grounded, embodied, lived experience. It's kind of like this whole, why people, but the Cartesian dualism gets a kind of a bad name, is of having some sort of intellectual higher understanding that's entirely cut off from the worldly experience, and then you become sick because of it. There's something that's out of balance or something like that, because you have some sort of revelation, but there's no way to actually make that revelation count for your act, where it counts, where it matters, the material, right? And so this is what people are saying, rather than chasing the big, chasing the divine, we need to be grounded into our daily life. We need to be grounded into the shared common reality we have with our friends, our family, and our neighbors, and all this kind of stuff, right? But the thing is, so, I mean, that whole perspective shouldn't actually be all that new or challenging, and maybe the people watching this video, you guys are already somewhat familiar with this perspective, right? One of the things about this Stephen Clark, anyways, I was just reading the Stephen Clark book, and I came across a certain passage, and when I read this passage, I started to think, hey, you know what? This something about this really goes with this Jupiter-Uranus thing for me. And then I think it was also because what this was is a quote from a guy named Bertrand Russell, who is considered to be one of the founding fathers of analytic philosophy, and together with Whitehead, he made the Principia Mathematica, or he was one of the founders of this idea of symbolic logic, of and the thing is, I have to admit though that this is like I only know a little bit. I watched a movie about Wittgenstein or whatever once. I'm not really. This is a kind of forays into areas that I'm not a complete expert on, and I've been doing a lot of reading, and I've been thinking about, you know, whether or not to include some of the stuff that I read in my astrology, or if it's better to omit it and keep these things separate. But in this case, the name Bertrand Russell, it could be because Rick Tarnas mentioned him in Cosmos and Psyche, and I had somehow stored it away in my memory somewhere. But I decided I'm going to look up Bertrand Russell's astrology chart, and what do you know? Bertrand Russell has a perfect, like a very close conjunction between Jupiter and Uranus in the sign of Cancer, right? So Bertrand Russell is a great example of a Jupiter-Uranus kind of person. But it's interesting because in all this, in the context of what Uranus has come to stand for, is, like I was saying, this kind of mind over matter, and this kind of revolutionary appeal, or the idea of progress and liberation, is that there's a certain attitude that would often dismiss things like religion and spirituality, and instead say that, like, the idea of the Enlightenment, that they're old, superstitious, irrational things that we put away, our progress is to progress away from them and have a kind of objective scientific understanding. And there's this whole thing about the idea of being able to think rationally and logically, and that I was, like, I don't know, I have to admit, I don't know a lot about Bertrand Russell. I was just reading his Wikipedia page this morning, but a lot of it was not about math or about logic, but him being his opinions on different political situations, like, and how his attitudes, like, he started off as a pacifist, and then in the middle of World War II, he had to say that, that fighting the Nazis was a necessary evil, and then he had all these attitudes about that may be very controversial today. Like, it's kind of a mixed bag, like, I'm not going to get into all the nitty gritty of that, but like, I am going to read this quote here that piqued something for me in terms of the Jupiter-Uranus archetype, right? It remains only to cherish, ere yet the blow falls, the lofty thoughts that ennoble his little day, disdaining the coward terrors of the slave of fate, to worship at the shrine that his own hands have built, undismayed by the empire of chance, to preserve a mind free from the wanton tyranny that rules his outward life, proudly defiant of the irresistible forces that tolerate for a moment his knowledge and his condemnation, to sustain alone a weary but unyielding Atlas, the world that his own ideals have fashioned despite the trampling march of unconscious power. And so, and this is, it's like the whole idea of Uranian progress and mind over matter is also, in here we can see it illustrated as also being kind of mind over circumstances. And that this idea that if we're living in a world that the situation, there's a lot of things. I'm not saying, I think there, at some basic level, there's a lot of things to be grateful for based on our experience as human beings in the world that we may overlook, right? But there's this kind of, like, he's kind of making this point of rather being blind slaves to fate, that we have some creative potential to rise above it, to be masters of our own destiny, to take responsibility for our own lives, rather than just saying it's some god that deals out this or that to us, that we have the rational ability to look at things from a scientific, objective kind of perspective, and take responsibility for building the life that we want, rather than just being a helpless victim blown about by these circumstantial winds and forces and all this kind of stuff. And I think there's something about this which is, it's like the other side of, rather than saying like, you shouldn't get so lost in some sort of abstract idea. You should, accept the reality around you and ground yourself into it. That there might be possible that the abstract idea is itself a breakthrough and a light bulb. Aha, we can do something different. I don't have to be a slave to this fate. I can actually make a better situation for you. And there's this profound optimism that comes out of that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention, I was reading the Wikipedia page on Bertrand Russell. One of the things that was said was that as a young man, apparently Bertrand Russell was profoundly depressed, even contemplating suicide, but it was the fact that he had an interest in studying, and the interest in mathematics and analytical philosophy developed out of this. But you could have this situation where a person is utterly depressed with the world or the situation in life, and even suicidal, but by having an intellectual pursuit that may not seem like it's grounded into the common reality around him, that gave him hope. That was the thing that lit up his life, that made life worth living for him, that also led him to make a name for himself, to become one of the founding fathers of analytic philosophy. And one of the things why I'm bringing this up is that what I notice in terms of interacting with the common, what seems to be the status quo or the common world around me, is that there seems to be this common distaste for things that are too intellectual, too logical, especially this kind of a cold, detached logic that is somehow elevated out of the lived experience. And that this kind of idea that you are just running away into a mental realm of the mind, and you are not, you need to ground into the world. But the thing is, what happens at first, maybe eventually this loops back into the actual world and has the effect of revolutionizing it, of changing it, and also maybe even making things better, right? And you don't get that if you just say, don't think about anything, don't read any, and don't talk about any ideas that would challenge people. Don't pursue any of these intellectual flights of fantasy. It's just, they're overly ambitious delusions of grandeur. Or you think you read all these books and you think you are superior. You think you're so smart, huh? And you're so better than us other people. All this kind of stuff is like, there's this other side to, and they say that because this kind of stuff is categorically not spiritual, because true spirituality has nothing to do with ideas. It has nothing to do with progress. It's all about being silent and about being accepting of the way that things already are, without trying to change anything, without trying to improve anything, and basically submitting to what other people want you to do, and just being a slave to your fate. If you were born into a certain family, into a certain circumstance, you just submit to that, and you don't challenge it. You just have to be, whereas there is a rebellious thing with your Jupiter-Uranus that actually wants to change something, that actually wants to make progress, that actually wants to make some improvements, and that if you try to stop the intellectual side of it, if you try to stop the theoretical or abstract side of it, it's like killing a newborn baby before it has a chance to develop into an adult. And saying, that we don't want any of your ideas because we find them threatening, or that we don't want, change scares us, that we don't want things to change. And so, like, the Buddhists actually say that everything is impermanent, and it's our resistance to change that makes us suffer, right? And that so there's this whole kind of thing that, like, and what Liz Greene was saying is that none of these planets is more spiritual than any of the other ones. And so there's this kind of broader conversation in the Stanley Clark book about the, Platonic idealism. And that if you go back to ancient Greece, there was something about the philosophers were closer, had more in common with the priests and the shamans and all this kind of stuff. And there was something, they saw the intellect and the mind not as some enemy that is troubling you with your invasive thoughts and your worries and stuff, but they saw the mind as having its own divinity, in the sense that if you had an ability to intellectually understand the situation, you actually had a capacity to solve problems and to take things that you were previously ignorant about and transform that through being more conscious to have a better solution, right? And what's amazing is that even the ancient Greeks had this principle of different kinds of fate, right? And this relates to the whole Saturn and Pisces thing, because Saturn has all sorts of things that you could say positive or negative about it, right? One of the negative things about Saturn is basically a kind of a blindness, or an inability to being fixed into a certain thing, an inability to grow, to overcome, an inability. There's a kind of a rigid fixity or a limit indicated. Oh, this is as far as it goes, right? What they were saying, the ancient Greeks said, there's a certain type of fate that is, you are fated to, this is the fate that your life follows because of ignorance. There could be, for example, maybe, if you're the fate of a person to die from an illness, or the fate of a person to survive and continue living, if people know how to cure or medicate that illness, the person doesn't have to die. But if the people don't understand the illness, if the people don't understand medicine, then that's what you call an area of unconscious. It's called a blind spot. It's called ignorance, right? If you are ignorant, if you don't know how to solve this problem, your fate is that problem is going to direct your fate, because you don't have any way to get around it, right? If you have insight into that problem, if you understand that problem, you're no longer at the mercy of that problem controlling your life, right? And so and the ancient Greeks saw this as well, and for this reason, because they associated this ability to actually understand and have insight into things with a kind of divinity, right? This idea of and then some people take this into a kind of a Christian direction, because there's this idea of, like, instead of having these sort of like blind gods of like Saturn, the blind god that eats his children and all this kind of stuff, like there's the opportunity, like Jupiter was the one that got away from Saturn and established his own order that was more based around generosity and mercy. And then they kind of make the argument that this was kind of like the archetypal blueprint, which would later evolve into Christianity, being, instead of, which is affirming these sort of humanitarian principles of kindness, forgiveness, the meek shall inherit the earth, rather than just being about brutal competition. Whatever barbarian horde kills the other one first wins. That there is a kind of this idea of a compassionate, and this is what I was trying to say before, where the Buddhists say that it's best to stay in the human realm, because like the animal realm is literally just dog. It's like whoever survival of the fittest is the Darwinian evolution is what drives evolution. Whereas the evolution of human consciousness brings us into an order where our own, it's not just animals fighting each other. We actually can have a more of an insight into these processes that govern the way things are, and we have the opportunity to progress and make different choices and things like that, right? So that's basically what my idea for Jupiter and Uranus and Taurus. And it's already been 15 minutes now, so I think that's good enough. And there's one thing that okay, well I'll just leave it at this. Maybe if I have more to add, I'll make another video later, or I'll continue to expound and explore these topics in another video. But this is my video for today. Thank you for watching, and thanks to all the new subscribers for supporting the channel and joining me on board here. Thanks for watching. All right.